much, David. And it is great to have you here in this street, and much of what you said resonates quite well here in this Warszawska street, which was actually a theater of the struggles and emancipatory struggles that you mentioned. So the floor is now yours. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. This one.
Hello, my name is Milan. I'm a fourth-year student of economics here in the Faculty of Economics, Zagreb. My main field of interest is political economy, and nowadays I'm reading one textbook of radical political economy by Samuel Bowles and Richard Edwards. And a lot of things that you said really, I can fit really a lot of things that you said in their textbook, but I have a problem with their textbook. Marx in theory, I accept it. I know something about Marx. I was really interested in Marx while I was in high school, but I have a problem with it because I don't know how to apply Marxian theory in today's world. I know how to apply Marx on factory production, but I don't know how to apply Marx on Facebook and Google. That's one. That's my question. How can you apply Marxian theory on Facebook, for example? And the other question is, it's not a question, but you're talking about some theories that I accept, and I agree with some of your theses, but my question is, what are the practical solutions? For example, I don't know whether or not you know, but in a few months there is a huge possibility that left-wing party, Social Democratic Party of Croatia, will win the elections. And what would you say to their president, Mr. Milanovic? What is his purpose, or what shall he do, what should he do? And what are the practical solutions for problems in Croatia? Or for Mr. Obama, if you want. Practical solutions.
Well, I'm afraid that part of my question is already posed right here. I wanted to ask you, you yourself, in your analysis of the crisis of the 1970s, state that Keynesian solutions were tried. That is, some costs were not externalized at the onset of the crisis, yet the states were forced after a certain period to externalize those costs. For example, the Swedish government, their reaction was not to externalize the costs at the very onset of the crisis. They used some other solutions, but that model of political economy did not prove itself as a viable one. While in the US, in all of Western Europe, Keynesian politics were used all the time. But the crisis of the 70s, in the crisis of the 70s, that model of political economy did not function. So what I'm asking you is, if we develop something that is akin to that model up to an extent, all those solutions are always embedded in the global political economy, in global capitalism. So that's my first question. Another one is regarding the South, the emancipation of the South. Yesterday in a discussion, and today as well, you've mentioned China in a rather negative manner. You've mentioned, even in the discussion with Giovanni Arrighi, that it's perhaps the worst example of capitalist development. My question is also this. To the countries of the South, their emancipation de facto, through the market mechanism, have any objective implications for emancipatory struggles that you've mentioned? That is, as Giovanni Arrighi stated in his last book, here the status trumps class in global relations. Without a certain amount of emancipation, done through the market mechanism, though, and with increased equality, is there any chance of emancipation on a global scale? Thank you.
Okay. First off, I've long learned that you don't give advice to people about their local situation. So what you advise your future Prime Minister should do is your own business, and you should figure it out. Having said that, and this dovetails a little bit, one of the things that's very important to do is to recognize that Marx did not complete his particular project of analyzing the dynamics of capitalism. I can go into this at length, but Capital as a book was written under certain constraints that Marx superimposed on himself, and that therefore there are many issues which are not covered in there and are deliberately left out of the picture. So you ask me the question, how do I apply it? Well, it's very difficult to do it because there is no theory of consumerism in Marx. Okay, the consumer does not register in the whole text, and to some degree, but that's for deliberate reasons. He said on page 1 of Capital, the study of that sort of thing, it belongs to history, not to political economy. And he separated political economy from history, and he was trying to create a sort of body of knowledge called political economy, which did not include that. When he turned to making his actual studies on the 18th Brumaire and so on, you don't find any of the propositions in Capital entering into the argument at all. So, you know, in other words, you have to understand that Marx's Capital is only a very partial understanding of how capitalism works. The other thing that is not covered at all in Capital, and when it is very unsatisfactorily, is, for example, the credit system. Now, various key points in Volume 1 of Capital, Marx mentions it and says, well, this all looks different when you introduce the credit system. In Volume 2 of Capital, which, by the way, is going on the web soon, my Volume 2 lectures are going on the web very soon, about every 10th page, Marx kind of says, this all looks different once the credit system is taken into account, but I'm not dealing with that here. When you get to the chapters on the credit system in Volume 3, it's a total mess. So, yeah, there's a lot of things like that that don't get caught in here, and there's a very interesting kind of question, for instance, which is very important to me, like, in our contemporary world, what is the power of merchant capital? And by merchant capital, I mean, you know, the peddlers of ideas, i.e. the media, Google, all those kinds of things, and of course Walmart, IKEA, Carrefour, and so on. And actually, Marx has a kind of proposition in volume, and when he does talk about it, he says, well, at one time merchant capital was autonomous and independent, but it actually ultimately gets subservient to production. Well, actually, right now, in terms of the political relationship, a lot of merchant capital dominates production. That is, Walmart dominates the producers back in China and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of things there that when you're reading Capital, you realize that are not covered. So what I do is to say, well, okay, I can do, you know, I try and put on my Marx hat and say, well, what would he have said about it in this situation? So I don't have a real big problem with that, but it means going very much beyond what is in Capital and the typical propositions that are derived from Capital about how capitalist economy works. I mean, I think, you know, Capital is a fantastic book, it's an incredible piece of analysis, but it's sort of analysis of only a piece of a much huger problem. So to me, that is, I think, you know, a very significant part of the understanding. Now, this is a way to morph into the Keynesian solution to crisis. Was always a temporary solution. Keynes never meant it as a permanent solution. It was basically when capital gets into a crisis, you use all those tools of monetary and fiscal policy to get out. And once you're out of the crisis, you withdraw all of those tools. If you don't, you'll get into a mess. So what happened in the 1960s is that there was permanent application of those tools when, in fact, there was no mess to be gotten out of, partly because, I mean, the famous saying of the chair of the Federal Reserve at the time was, well, what the chair of the Federal Reserve is supposed to do is to take away the punch bowl just as the party gets going. But they never wanted to do that. And they never did that. And then the big result of the Keynesian solution is inflation. And guess what is one of the big problems in China right now? Inflation. Inflationary pressures are very strong. Guess what the inflation rate is in Brazil? Guess what it is in Argentina? Guess what it is in Australia? Australia's had to, I mean, we have 0 interest rates in the United States effectively. In Australia, the interest rate's around 5% because of the inflationary pressures, which, by the way, gives finance capital a great opportunity to borrow at 0% in the United States and lend, you know, at 5% in Australia. So there's a carrying trade going on. All kinds of games like that get played. So the point is that the Keynesian solution is not a solution that has any permanent possibility. And to the degree that it is applied in a permanent way, it will run into long-run inflation, which we saw kicking in the 1960s and 1970s. And in the United States in the 1970s, the inflation rate was around 14–15%. So, you know, and at that point, of course, you put on the austerity measures and you go and, you know, you raise the interest rate to 17% and you create unemployment and all the other things which went on in the Reagan years. So there's that problem. Now, the other issue of the Global South, it seems to me, depends what you're talking about. I mean, there are solutions which are being pursued in China, which I have a real geographical problem calling it in the South, because it's, you know, it's a bit too north for me to be in the South, but that's it's a very literal kind of objection. But actually, some of the things that are going on with, for instance, in Bolivia, are extremely interesting in the sense that they are actually probing alternative political economies. In much of Brazil, there is a great deal of experimentation with solidarity economies and other ways, and of course you'll know that the Porto Alegre budgetary sharing is a social democratic thing, but on the other hand, it's the beginnings of something, and the environmental stuff in Curitiba and so on. So there's a lot of experimentation going on in Latin America, looking for different ways of trying to proceed. But of course, you are surrounded by, quote, the market economy and how the market economy is working. And you always have to find some way to accommodate to global market forces. And that's a big and tricky kind of question. But I don't see that question can simply be sort of a reason for saying, oh, well, you can't do anything. I used to hear these stories all the time. You know, in Baltimore, trying to work in Baltimore politics, people would say, well, globalization won't let you, or this won't let you. And actually, that is not the case. There's a lot of possibilities within the framework which already exists for experimentation with something really radically different. And we do see that in the way in which various states in Latin America are trying to explore alternatives. And this is very different, it seems to me, from the kind of thing that is going on in China. And I'm not wholly negative about China. I think that actually I have a lot of sense that there are many things going on the ground in China which we probably don't know about, which are probably very, very interesting. But I think the strategy, the global strategy, which is emanating from China, is creating a temporary respite for the global economy by reviving a certain kind of growth. But when you look at the environmental consequences of that growth, and the fact that the Chinese in many ways are copying what went on in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. They're building the equivalent of the interstate highway system. They're suburbanizing like crazy. They're even building gated communities with golf courses inside of them. And the number of billionaires which is erupted in China is enormous. And they really don't know what to do with their money. I mean, I read a piece the other day that kind of said they had a billionaires meeting and they were all invited to bring the most expensive bottle of wine they had in their cellars, and they were all coming with bottles of wine that cost $2,000 or $3,000 or $5,000. And what they did was they poured all of these wines into one punch bowl and then drank the mix. and at that point, the United States saw a great opportunity, so it sent a whole bunch of people to tell them how to drink wine. So it's kind of, I mean, this kind of stuff. Now, the same thing we've seen happening in India. The number of billionaires in India has grown from 26, I think it was, 3 years ago, to 69 now. And billionaires are erupting all over Mexico. And so it's kind of, you know, we've got a global plutocracy forming. And they are actually shaping the world according to their own image. And that seems to me to be the crucial political question. Rather than the political pressure that's being organized through the market system, which says the market system won't let you. Well, the market system is fungible, and yeah, there are pressures that emerge through that, through competition, but there are ways of limiting competition. I mean, we're told that we're in a world of monopoly capital. I don't believe that. If we are in a world of monopoly capital, then competition doesn't matter. I think actually competition does matter right now, and again, there are various ways in which competition can be attenuated. And if you relieve the pressures of competition, then of course this race to the bottom that we see and all of those other things starts to be seen in a completely different light. Imagine that the world turns around and starts to compete on positive gains. I mean, the paradox to me is that some cities which are considered not very good from the standpoint of economic development turn out to be rather delightful places to live in. Berlin, for example, is not considered a great place in terms of the economy, but actually it's a rather wonderful city to live in, because the pressures which exist in, you know, most other cities, and the gentrification and all those kinds of things, well, it's going on there, but it's not gone on like it has in New York or London or any of those places. So, you know, quality of life starts to be very important, and what anti-gentrification struggles are about are preserving certain qualities of life, rather than let the developers take over and reshape the city according to their heart's desire rather than to my heart's desire. So this is, if you like, where the politics comes in, and I think you're seeing throughout the global south actually much more innovative responses to that. And the political movements are much more vibrant. The movements against peasant dispossessions, which are going on in India, for example, are producing new social movements of great significance. And so, yeah, I have a lot of hope, actually, that part of the world is going to be much more vigorous in pursuing, you know, alternatives than we are. It's very difficult to persuade suburbanites in the United States that anything should change. They want solutions to everything, but don't change my lifestyle. And I keep saying, no, you've got to change your lifestyle. No, I'm not going to do it. And so we have those difficulties which other places don't.
Okay, one question. First, don't worry.
Thank you. I'm very happy to see you and hear you after all my life. I was learning from your books and aging with them, and now I'm old, but you are never finished. That's very nice. I'm happy to see you here, and I really enjoyed what you said before. I'm an urban sociologist, and I would like to put you a question from that field about some things about cities and the rest. Well, as all Marxists are, they are very harsh at the beginning, as you were, you know, criticizing everything. I am the same, but we are now talking about you. And when you come to conclusions, somehow you become mild. Whatever you say, I do not understand. What is it? I would like, if you think about cities and the structure of how to change them, would you be so kind to make it, if you can do it shortly? How do you imagine changing of cities? who are the actors, how they will play in this world which is really managerial and capitalistic systems we are approaching to as well. You have any idea, structured idea, not like blah blah, you know what I mean? I love your works, I love you, everything, but please, if you can be more concrete, I would be very happy and pleased. Thank you.
What was the, so there was one hand here.
Imali smo nekoga ovdje, ovdje.
Imamo nekog skroz gore i bio je neko tu. Okay.
It's a question about the, I think there is an assumption in your perspective of began with the cities to think about the struggles. I was thinking that another way to the solution to stop the austerity model was to persuade the citizens to elect parties that give back to the state the power over economy. This was one way, a classical way, we may say. You offer a new way, and very interesting. And I'd like to ask you, what makes you think that this way of look at the cities as spaces of collective action, in the meaning you said, makes the way more easy, maybe? I'd like if you could deeper develop the argument. Why the cities? Because I agree with you. It's a very interesting idea. But what's the difference? Why is easier to mobilize people at the scale of a city?
Hello, good evening. Thank you for the lecture. Now, obviously, I sort of agree with the idea that the cities, because of unprecedented urbanization upon which the world has entered some, you can trace it back 100 or more years ago, and obviously the great collection of people live in the cities today. So I want to ask you a question. How do you think this connects, if you're aware of the work of, say, Andres Duani, and the general sort of, I know you mentioned, you touched upon Curitiba, which has that environmental program of public transit systems and so on. Then there is the cycle cities like Copenhagen and Amsterdam and Vancouver. No, I'm not sure about Vancouver, but certain cities in France. How would you incorporate these, like you mentioned, primarily ecologic or environmental programs into the sort of right to the city and the entire program that you think we should develop, the left should develop?
Let me take a little path through this. One of the ways in which I think you can think about this, during the crisis in Argentina, of course, many factories got abandoned, and then they got recuperated and taken over and run by population. And there are examples where this has taken place, but they always fall afoul of the problem that they don't get support from within the credit system and from within the retail system, or necessarily even from the state. So, while there's been a long history of eradicating the class relation between capital and labour in production through workers' collectives and workers' control and all the rest of it, many initiatives in that direction have not survived because the environment in which they exist has been hostile to them. So one of the purposes of having a politics around the line I'm talking about is, tax the hell out of the capitalists until they abandon their factories and then take them over and give them a lot of support. And the one system, you know, which is worker cooperative system that has survived since its founding, 1957, is Mondragon. And the interesting thing about Mondragon is that they actually formed a credit system and a retail sector at the same time as they're taking over factories. That is, in Marx's terms, they operated in all three circuits of capital. And that's what you've got to do in order to survive. So I see that as an incremental way in which you can start to take over the classic means of production rather than simply by direct expropriation as a way of doing it. Now, organizing a whole city, well, there have been times when cities have been organized, but honestly, we've never really tried it, actually. And we've never really thought in terms of the politics of it, but when you start to look at it, it turns out it's a very interesting history. We actually have a socialist who's a senator in the United States. Amazing. How did he become senator in the United States? He was the mayor of a city, and he reorganized the city in such a way that everybody loved what he was doing. And, you know, and eventually, since he's in a small state, everybody recognized Bernie Sanders as the mayor of Burlington, who had really done a fantastic job of mayor and helped reorganize the whole city, its waste proposals, its waste structures, and all the rest of it. And eventually, when he ran for Senate, he got elected in you know, a part of the world that doesn't normally, he got elected with an amazing majority. Actually, even in the United States, the city of Milwaukee had a socialist mayor up until the 1960s, from the 1920s onwards. In other words, organizing at the city level has been a very powerful political force, and I think it's true even, I mean, this is a crude generalization, so it's probably, you know, plenty of exceptions, but the Communist Party in France, when it went into municipal politics, had a particular advantage. It had no instructions from Moscow on what to do. It had no theory to guide them, so they worked by the seat of their pants. And to the degree that the Communist Party in France still has an influence, it's because they have mayors of municipalities, not because of their point of production. So, in other words, you know, these are places, and the Greater London Council, during the Thatcher years, was an attempt to create an alternative form of organisation, and it was so successful that Margaret Thatcher had to abolish the Greater London Council because it was such a threat. So, you know, there's a long history of doing this kind of stuff, and to the degree, and this is the point about it, that a lot of what's going on, when I talk about reproduction as the realm which is significant, a lot of this is going to not sound revolutionary, it's going to be reformist. But there is such a thing as revolutionary reformism. Okay? And this is a hugely interesting place to practice it and to search it out. And once you get people on your side and people say, yeah, that makes sense. This is a good, you know, this makes sense to you, we can do this. And, you know, you're asking me for sort of concrete examples of how things work along these lines. Well, you know, a lot of this is sort of almost personal opportunism of how organisation grows up. I mean, I used to walk my dog in my local park down in Baltimore all the time, and people put a lot of junk in the park, and often I would pick up the junk as I was walking my dog. And suddenly I noticed other people picking up their junk, and very soon there's a whole organisation of us that were into picking up our junk. And we had a very interesting kind of situation where half of the community was dumping stuff in the park, and the other half was taking it out. And this was a nice sort of input-output system. So in the end, some of my comrades in the park decided to go to the schools and start to educate the kids about, you know, not dumping stuff in the park and caring for it and all this kind of stuff. And at that point, the municipality came along to us and said, we don't want to run the park anymore, you guys want to run it on your own, because we don't have the money to do it. And we said, well, you've got to give us resources and that, and then maybe we'll do some self-organizing. And so some of that sort of went on. And after a while, we suddenly found there were all these other organizations around the city, and similar parks are doing the same thing. And pretty soon we have a regional parks movement, which is about protection of the parks. Now this is a very concrete example of how a movement actually kind of gets going and actually sort of starts to do stuff with parks. Now, like I say, this is not the revolution. On the other hand, it's doing something about the quality of daily life. And the people who are engaged in it can actually then relate to each other around a particular project of a certain kind. And I think this is so when you ask me for concrete solutions, it seems to me you're asking me for a blueprint, when really what I'm talking about is a political process that has to be a political process of self-organizing. But at the same time as it's about self-organizing, it's also about recognizing that the self-organizing that's going on has a greater vision than simply organizing around that thing. Now, what's happened politically, and I don't know whether this is true in many other parts of the world, but certainly in the United States, we have a lot of urban social movements that are about specific issues. We have a fantastic organization around the homeless. Picture the homeless, they're incredible. And of course, one of the things they're doing is occasionally they do things like occupy a vacant house and put the homeless in it. And, they do things. And then there's an organisation which is anti-gentrification, and then there's an organisation which is about the rights of gay and lesbian and transgender youth, to have a social a public space. And then there's an anti-criminalisation movement. They all start to get together and say, we have a bigger picture. And how do all of our bits relate to each other around the idea of changing New York City? Which is why they formed, amongst themselves, the Right to the City Alliance. I didn't tell them what to do. They formed this thing called the Right to the City Alliance. And I said at some point or other, one of my students told me about it, and I said, well, I'm interested in that. We've been interested in that, so let's have a conversation. So we've been in conversation with them. Same thing happens with the excluded workers. The domestic workers organize themselves and now have, I think, a very, very powerful organization. And if all the domestic workers don't turn up one day to work, the whole of Manhattan will be completely lost knowing what to do about childcare and all this kind of stuff. So I think there's organization going on. So when you ask me about concrete proposals, my answer is I don't necessarily have to have concrete proposals. I see there's a process there which is actually reorganizing the city and doing things in the city anyway. And what the left has to do is to work with those movements and not kind of dismiss them as just community movements. I mean, there's a tremendous history on, the Marxist left of kind of saying, well, that's urban struggles and that has nothing to do with us. My argument has always been it should be very centrally to do with us. And we therefore have to work with it. And one of the things we could do, I mean, my relationship to groups like the excluded workers and the Right to the City is this. I don't tell them what to do. I don't come up with concrete proposals about they should do this or that. What I can do with them is to say, well, if you are interested in thinking about the broader picture of what's going on in general, and when I say to them things like, well, it's the externalization of costs of social reproduction that's going on, they get it. When I use a phrase like accumulation by dispossession instead of primitive accumulation, which they didn't understand, they get it. And they use those terms and say, there's accumulation by dispossession going on in this city, and we're going to stop it. And it's not only me being dispossessed, other people are being dispossessed. And so there's, so to me, it's about a dialogue of a certain sort with organizations which are actively involved. And I think, the left should be heavily involved in this, and actually a lot of creative new left thinking is coming out of those organizations. And we should take account of it. We have to learn from them. I've learned a tremendous amount from organizations of this kind. They teach me, I don't teach them, they teach me. And if I come here and tell you something sensible, it has everything to do with what they've taught me, rather than me kind of going to them and lecturing them about what they're doing. That's the wrong way around. So my work is very much to try to take what they're doing and see some way, can it be synthesized, can it be related to these broader kind of processes and forms of analysis. And so when the Excluded Workers Congress asks me to come and talk about the general political situation, it's because they want to know. And they want to know how their actions are actually related to these general kinds of questions. And then they do ask exactly the kind of question you were posing, which is, well, maybe we ought to be thinking about stopping the whole damn system. And how do we do that? Because clearly, you know, we're limited in terms of what we can do about homelessness in New York City until we start to grasp the way in which the city is being manipulated by developers and financiers in such a way as to turn it into one vast gated community for the millionaires and billionaires. And at that point I kind of say, well, what would happen if the construction unions in New York City suddenly said, we are not going to build another upper income condominium until you have built 100,000 units of affordable housing for low income people. And they laid down their tools and said, that's that. What kind of city would we be living in? We'd be living in a completely different place. And when you go to the construction unions and you say something like that, they kind of say, well, no. On the other hand, you know, it's a form of organising. When I talked about the New South Wales, you know, when they did that sort of thing, they were very effective, extremely effective. And all I'm saying is that we have to be alert and aware of all of those kinds of possibilities and talk about those possibilities. And a lot of left thinking doesn't actually concentrate on those possibilities at all. It's locked into a kind of a rather traditionalist view of what the left is supposed to be about, which is generally workerist and all the rest of it. And so that is, in effect, why, you know, the way I would position myself in relationship to it. I don't give blueprints. I don't go out and give concrete suggestions to people who know much, much better than I do what is a concrete possibility in their own lives.
Sure we'll be able to hopefully have an opportunity to continue this discussion once your book will come out in Croatian translation by Stipe Ćurković very soon, apparently, from what I hear. So it will be great to see you then in Zagreb and then talk not only about the movement that we have called the Right to the City, but of some victories of our urban struggle. Thank you all, and thank you, David Harvey.
Dio čovjek, sve u